Northern California, the 1880s. Along a 100-mile belt of fog-soaked coast from Humboldt County down toward Mendocino, the coast redwood stands as the tallest living thing on Earth. Sequoia sempervirens climbs past 300 feet, and the greatest of them near 350, taller than a 30-story building, taller than any structure most Americans of the era have ever seen. At the swollen base, a single trunk can measure 20 feet across, weigh one whole, and the scale turns absurd. Roughly 450 tons of wood, bark, and water, standing in a column that has not moved in 2,000 years. Some of these trees were seedlings when Rome was still a republic. They were centuries old before the first European crossed the Atlantic. Their bark alone runs a foot thick, fibrous, and fire-resistant. A rust-red armor that has turned away lightning, drought, and wildfire for millennia. Beneath the canopy, the light goes green and dim, the forest floor soft with 1,000 years of fallen needles, and the silence is enormous. Into this cathedral came men with axes. What confronted them was not a lumber problem in any ordinary sense. A pine or a fir, a logger could drop in an afternoon. A mature redwood was a geological event that happened to be alive. There was no machine on Earth in 1885 that could cut it. No engine, no blade, no hydraulic ram equal to the task. There was only muscle, steel, patience, and time measured in days. A crew might spend the better part of a week on one tree and count it good work. The mills at Eureka and Scotia were hungry. The redwood straight, clear, rot-proof grain built the cities of the West, and every foot of it had to be won by hand. To understand how it was done, you first have to understand who did it. The choppers and fallers and bull punchers who walked into these groves with the crudest of tools and took on the largest organisms the planet had ever grown. They're the ones we meet next. They came for the giants in outfits of 8 or 10 men, and every man had a job the others depended on. At the top stood the fallers, often called choppers, the elite of the woods, paid the best wages because theirs was the most dangerous and skilled labor in camp. Below them ran the buckeers, the swampers who cleared brush, the chokermen, and the bull punchers who drove the oxen. The animals mattered as much as the men. Teams of 6, 8, sometimes a dozen yoked oxen. The bulls, hauling logs down greased skid roads, while the puncher walked alongside, goad in hand, cursing in a language of its own. Many of the men were immigrants. Scandinavians, Portuguese from the Azores, Irishmen, French Canadians drawn west by wages of $2 or $3 a day and found. They lived in bunkhouses thick with wood smoke and wet wool, rose before dawn, and worked until the light failed. Their toolkit was almost shockingly simple. A double-bitted axe, kept honed like a razor, a crosscut saw, steel wedges and a sledge, the mallet they called a maul, springboards, oil bottles to keep pitch off the blade, files for sharpening in the field, no engines yet, no cables, no power of any kind but their own backs and the pull of the oxen. Injury was constant in death routine. A rolling log or a falling limb, the aptly named Widowmaker, could kill a man in an instant, and the graveyards of the timber towns filled with young ones. Yet these crews filled the impossible on grit and craft alone, reading each tree the way a sailor reads weather. Before an axe ever bit deep, the faller studied his giant for the better part of an hour. Its lean, its rot, the lay of the ground where it would come down. Everything that followed depended on aiming 450 tons with precision. And that aiming began not with the saw, but with a notch cut deliberately into the living wood, the undercut. Everything began with the undercut, the directional notch, also called the face, chopped into the side of the tree, facing where the faller meant it to fall. Get it right, and 450 tons dropped exactly where planned, into a cleared bed. Get it wrong, and the tree could split, kick back, or crush the crew, and no man in the redwoods forgot that. So the faller read his tree first. He walked around it, gauging the natural lean, the weight of the crown, the direction and strength of the coastal wind that could rise by afternoon. He studied the grain and the swell of the trunk and the pitch of the ground, because a giant dropped across a stump or a ravine would shatter into worthless splinters, and shattered redwood was money lost. Only then did the axes come out. Working from springboards set into the bark, two choppers faced each other and swung in alternating rhythm, each stroke landing an inch from the last, the double-bitted blades biting out fist-sized chips that piled ankle-deep below. They cut a horizontal curve first, then angled down from above to meet it, carving a wide wedge-shaped bite that might reach a third of the way through a trunk 12 or 15 feet across. Hour after hour the notch deepened, the men pausing only to hone an edge gone dull on the tough, stringy fiber, or to shift a board. A good chopper could place a peg or a stake on the ground and drive the falling tree onto it, a party trick that was also deadly serious proof of control. The undercut was where the whole felling was won or lost, a piece of applied geometry executed with nothing but an axe and a practiced eye. But the notch was only half the cut. It aimed the tree. It did not fell it. To bring the giant down, the crew had to attack from the far side, and to reach clean wood above the flared, punky base, they first had to get up off the ground entirely, climbing the tree on planks driven into its own bark. The base of a redwood was the worst place to cut it. There the trunk flared into a swollen, buttressed foot, wider, softer, threaded with pitch, and often hollowed by old fire scars. A cut made down at ground level meant sawing through the widest, punkiest part of the whole tree, adding feet of useless girth to the labor, so the loggers refused to cut there. Instead they climbed, and their ladder was the tree itself. A chopper took his axe and cut a narrow-angled notch into the bark, 4 or 5 feet up, a slot perhaps 8 inches wide. Into it he slid a springboard, a stout plank 6 feet long, tipped with an iron shoe or lip that bit into the wood and locked the board in place under a man's weight. He stepped up onto it, balanced there, and chopped a second notch higher still, driving in a second board, working his way up the flank of the giant 1 plank at a time, until he stood 8, 10, sometimes 12 feet above the forest floor. From that narrow perch, a springy plank no wider than his boots, with nothing beneath him but the drop, he worked. The boards flexed with each stroke, and the name fit. A good springboard gave back a little bounce that a skilled man used to add force to his swing. 2 fallers, each on his own board on opposite sides of the notch, could stand nearly face to face across a trunk 15 feet through. It looks reckless in the old photographs, and it was. A slip meant a fall onto axes and wedges, or worse, being caught aloft when the tree began to move. But it was also shrewd engineering, trading a few feet of dangerous height for a cut through clean, sound, narrower wood that saved days of sawing. Perched up there above the swell, the undercut finished, and the face aimed true, the crew turned at last to the tool that would actually sever the tree, the great 2-man crosscut saw. Now came the saw, and in the redwoods it was a monster of its own. The 2-man crosscut, the misery whip, ran 7, 9, sometimes 12 feet from handle to handle, a ribbon of tempered steel long enough to reach clear through the biggest trunks in the world. Its teeth were cut in a deliberate pattern, rows of sharp cutters to sever the fiber, in between them raker teeth that scooped the severed wood out as sawdust so the blade wouldn't bind in the deep, wet redwood. A crew filed and set those teeth by hand every day, because a dull saw in a 450-ton tree was worse than useless. It was dangerous. 2 men worked it, 1 on each springboard, and the rhythm was everything. Neither man pushed. A pushed blade buckled and jammed. Instead, each pulled in turn. You pull, I ride. I pull, you ride. The steel hissing back and forth on a long, patient stroke, while the man not pulling let his hands go loose and rode the return. They started the back cut on the side opposite the undercut, a few inches above the base of the notch, and sawed straight in toward it. It was brutal, monotonous, endless labor, sweat soaked through wool and the cold coastal air. The men swapped an oil bottle down the cut to keep pitch from gumming the blade, and stopped to file when the whip began to drag. Hours passed. On the largest trees, a single back cut could take most of a day, the kerf swallowing the 12-foot blade until only the handle showed. As the saw crept toward the undercut, the standing wood between the two cuts, the hinge, grew thinner and thinner, until only a narrow band of fiber held 450 tons upright. There, the sawing had to stop. Cut too far, and the tree could sit back and pinch the blade, or drop without warning. The last of the work would not be done by the saw at all. It would be done by steel, driven into the cut with a sledge, the wedges that finally tipped the giant over. The back cut was in, but no saw on earth could push a giant over. That final work belonged to steel. Fallers drove tapered wedges, hardened iron slabs, 4 to 8 pounds apiece, into the kerf behind the crosscut blade. A man swung a maul, and the flat ring of iron on iron rang through the Humboldt canyons, slow and deliberate, a blow every few seconds. Each strike lifted the trunk a hair's width, tilting 450 tons of redwood toward the undercut that gaped on the far side. 2, 3, sometimes a dozen wedges climbed the back cut in a stepped row. The men watched the top, not the base. A lean of a few degrees at the crown meant 100 feet of sway. They listened too. The first sound was a dry, ticking deep in the wood, then a groan as fibers stretched and tore along the holding wood the fallers had deliberately left uncut. The hinge that steered the fall. When the groan became a crack like a rifle shot, the cry went up, "Timber down the line!" And every man dropped his tools and ran uphill and to the side, never straight back. A butt could kick backward off the stump and crush a slow man in an instant. The crown began to move, imperceptibly. Then all at once, sweeping through the fog in a widening arc, faster and faster until it fell like the closing of the sky. The impact was not a sound so much as a blow to the ground itself. 300 feet of trunk struck the earth and the shock rolled outward, snapping smaller trees, throwing a wall of duff, bark, and splinters 20 feet into the air. Men felt it in their boots 100 yards off. The forest that had stood silent for 2,000 years lay still, steaming faintly in the cold, its rings counting back past Columbus, past the Caesars. And then the real labor began, because a fallen redwood was not yet lumber. It was a mountain of wood that had to be carved apart where it lay. A downed redwood could stretch the length of a city block, its trunk taller than a man could reach, even lying on its side. Before anyone could move it, the giant had to be divided, bucking, the loggers called it, sawn crosswise into logs short enough to drag and load. Two-man crews walked the length of the fallen trunk, marking cuts every 16, 20, or 32 feet, reading the wood for shakes and rot that would waste a section. Then the crosscut saws went back to work, this time driving straight down through 8, 10, 12 feet of solid heartwood. A single bucking cut on a large tree could take 2 men the better part of a day. They greased the blades with kerosene bottles hung on a nail to keep the pitch from binding the steel, and they hammered wedges into the cut behind them so the log's own weight would not pinch the saw and stop it dead. Some trunks were simply too vast to saw apart in any reasonable time. For these, the crews turned to black powder. Borers were augured into the wood, charges tamped and fused, and with a shout the powder split the log along its grain, tearing open sections that no blade could have parted. It was crude, dangerous work. A misjudged charge shattered good lumber or sent slabs flying, but on the biggest giants, it was the only way through. Cutting and dividing one tree could consume days, and on the largest specimens, weeks. A crew might fell a redwood on a Monday and still be bucking and splitting its trunk when the next week's fog rolled in. Every log then had to be stripped of bark, its ends beveled into a blunt nose so it would slide, and rolled with peavies and jacks toward the skid road. For decades, that road was the limit of the whole enterprise, the point where oxen and muscle met the mud. Moving these logs to the mill was a problem no axe could solve, and it was about to summon the machines. For a generation, the redwood came out of the woods behind oxen. Teams of 6, 8, a dozen bulls dragged logs along, skid roads. Parallel half-buried logs, greased and laid like railroad ties, while a bullwhacker walked alongside, cursing the animals forward through the mud. It was slow, and it was the bottleneck of the entire industry. A crew could fell far more timber than the oxen could ever haul. The answer arrived, hissing and smoking. In the 1880s, the steam donkey, a wood-fired boiler bolted to a sledge, turning a drum wound with wire cable, appeared in the Humboldt woods. Anchored to a stump, the donkey engine winched logs across ground no ox team could cross, dragging tons of redwood on a taut steel line at a speed that made the old skid roads obsolete almost overnight. One donkey and its whistle-punk signal boy could do the work of dozens of animals. Then came the rails. Logging railroads pushed narrow-gauge track deep into the cut, sometimes on trestles bridged across ravines 100 feet down. Geared locomotives, Shays, Climaxes, Heislers, built to crawl up brutal grades and around tight curves, hauled loaded flat cars stacked with single logs so large that one filled an entire car. What had taken oxen a day now took a train an hour. By 1900, the biggest operations ran their own rail networks, their own repair shops, their own company towns. The machines changed the arithmetic of the forest. Steam and steel let companies reach timber that had been unprofitable, cut faster, and haul farther, feeding mills that ran day and night. Redwood built the boom towns of California. The fences, the water tanks, the railroad ties, and the houses of San Francisco rebuilt after the 1906 quake. But for all the boilers and locomotives, the tree itself still came down the same way it had for 50 years. 2 men, a springboard, a crosscut saw, and a row of wedges. The machines had conquered the hauling. The falling was still done by hand, and that last stronghold of muscle was about to end. The change came in the 1930s, and it came fast. Portable chainsaws, heavy 2-man machines at first, gasoline engines with a bar and chain where the crosscut had been, reached the West Coast woods and did in minutes what had taken a full day. A backcut that 2 sawyers had sweated over from dawn to noon now fell to a single operator before lunch. The rhythmic rasp of the misery whip, the sound that had defined the redwood forest for half a century, began to fade. Alongside the saws came the tracked bulldozer. Where oxen had once strained down greased skid roads and steam donkeys had winched from anchored stumps, diesel crawlers now shoved roads through the hills, dragged logs on steel tracks, and went where no rail could reach. Together, the chainsaw and the bulldozer collapsed the old sequence of springboards, handsaws, wedges, oxen, and donkey engines into a handful of machines and men. The springboard notch, chopped into the bark so a faller could stand above the swell, disappeared from the trade. The 12-foot crosscut, the kerosene bottle, the maul, and the row of steel wedges went to the walls of museums and the backs of barns. The men who had read the lean of a 2,000-year-old tree and steered its fall with the hinge of holding wood grew old, and their craft went with them. What they left behind was almost unimaginable in scale. The felling of the largest living things on earth, accomplished with hand tools, endurance, and nerve. Crews had climbed trees wider than houses just to begin cutting, worked platforms feet above the ground, and brought down 450 tons of redwood with a directional notch and a patient row of wedges. It could take days, sometimes weeks, to fell and divide a single giant. That vanished world of the springboard and the 2-man saw belongs now to photographs and memory, a reminder of an age when the tallest forests on the continent were brought down entirely by 2 things and nothing more. Before the chainsaw, only muscle and steel.